Behind every locked door lies a story the world was never meant to hear. Welcome to Behind Bars TV, where we uncover the hidden realities of the world's toughest prisons, untold inmate experiences, and the systems built to contain them. From supermax facilities to forgotten penitentiaries, we revealed the truth behind concrete walls and razor wire. This is not fiction. This is the world behind bars. Most brutal prison in California is in Quentin. Constitutional violations, institutional control. California calls itself progressive, reform-minded, human rights conscious. But sitting on the edge of San Francisco Bay is a prison that tells a very different story. A prison older than the state itself. A prison where executions happened for decades. A prison where men were locked in cages, so small the courts eventually stepped in. This isn't a story about riots or escapes. It's about power, control, and how constitutional rights slowly disappear. When an institution decides order matters more than humanity. This is San Quentin State Prison. And what happened here forced judges, lawmakers, and the public to confront an uncomfortable truth. Brutality doesn't always look like chaos. Sometimes, it looks like policy. California's oldest prison. San Quentin opened in 1852. Before California was even fully organized as a state. It was built to house gold rush criminals, bandits, and outlaws. But over time, San Quentin became something else. The center of California's punishment system. It housed the state's death row, its execution chamber, its most high-profile inmates. And while California evolved around it, San Quentin often didn't. Overcrowding, aging infrastructure, outdated philosophies of control. By the late 20th century, San Quentin wasn't just old. It was dangerously obsolete. Death row by design. For decades, San Quentin housed the largest death row in the Western Hemisphere. More than 700 men, confined to cages barely larger than closets. Cells stacked on top of each other. Poor ventilation. Constant noise. Men spent decades waiting to die. In conditions courts later described as psychologically torturous. Some inmates went years without meaningful human contact. Others deteriorated mentally in full view of staff. San Quentin's death row wasn't just about punishment. It was about containment at all costs. And that containment would eventually collide with the Constitution. Over control and neglect. San Quentin ran on extremes. Extreme control. Extreme neglect. In some areas, inmates were locked down for days. In others, violence went unchecked. Medical care lagged dangerously behind need. Mental health treatment was inconsistent at best. Guards were understaffed. Facilities crumbling. Policies reactive instead of preventative. The prison survived by improvisation. And improvisation in a maximum security prison creates abuse. But the most damning chapter of San Quentin's story wasn't written by inmates. It was written by judges. Because eventually the courts had seen enough. The death row lawsuits. For years, San Quentin defended its death row as necessary. Necessary for security. Necessary for control. Necessary for managing hundreds of condemned men in one place. Then the lawsuits started landing. Inmates didn't argue innocence. They argued conditions. Cages so small men couldn't stretch their arms. Constant noise that never stopped. Lighting that never truly went dark. Temperatures that spiked without relief. Attorneys described it as psychological torture by architecture. Medical experts testified that prolonged exposure caused severe anxiety, hallucinations, cognitive decline, suicidal ideation. Judges began asking a dangerous question. If execution is the sentence, can the waiting itself be a second punishment? The state struggled to answer. Because San Quentin wasn't built to hold death row for decades. It was built to hold men temporarily, until execution. And when executions slowed, the system broke. Solitary confinement as control. When San Quentin couldn't manage behavior, it isolated it. Solitary confinement wasn't just a punishment. It was a management strategy. Inmates were placed in isolation for alleged gang affiliation, minor rule violations, protective custody requests. Sometimes no clear reason at all. Men spent months, sometimes years, alone. No programs. No human contact. Minimal sunlight. Psychologists warned the administration. Long-term solitary causes lasting mental damage. San Quentin kept using it anyway, because isolation was efficient, quiet, predictable, easy to justify. One former inmate said, "Solitary wasn't about discipline. It was about erasing you until you complied." That philosophy would later haunt the state in court. Mental illness behind bars. San Quentin became a mental health facility by accident, not because it treated illness, but because it created it. Inmates with no prior diagnosis deteriorated rapidly. Men began talking to themselves, screaming at night, refusing food, self-harming. The response? Medication through slots, observation instead of therapy, isolation instead of treatment. Mental health staff were overwhelmed. Beds were full. Resources were scarce. Inmates in crisis were often disciplined, not treated. Federal filings later described this as criminal neglect, a system that recognized mental illness and punished it anyway. By this point, the evidence was overwhelming. The cages, the isolation, the mental collapse. And still, San Quentin stayed open, because violence wasn't the only problem. Race was. And inside these walls, race determined everything. Guard culture and use of force. Every prison has rules. San Quentin had customs. Use of force wasn't just a last resort, it was a language. Cell extractions happened fast. Batons came out early. Pepper spray filled enclosed spaces. Official reports often described incidents as necessary force. Video footage, when it existed, told a different story. Inmates were subdued long after compliance. Force continued after restraints were applied. Medical checks were delayed or skipped entirely. Former guards later described a culture where aggression was normalized, not ordered, expected. One ex-officer admitted, "If you hesitated, you were seen as weak, and weakness got people hurt." That culture fed on fear. Fear of riots, fear of ambushes, fear of losing control in an overcrowded, volatile prison. But when fear dictates policy, force becomes routine, and routine force becomes abuse. Racial violence and segregation. Inside San Quentin, race wasn't just identity. It was survival. Inmates were expected to align racially, for protection, for resources, for safety. Housing assignments reinforced it. Yard access reflected it. Lockdowns were triggered by it. When violence broke out, entire racial groups were punished. Segregation wasn't official policy, but it was practiced. Guards understood the dynamics. Administrators acknowledged them quietly. And yet, the system relied on racial division to maintain order. Federal courts later questioned whether this violated equal protection laws. But San Quentin defended it as pragmatic, necessary to prevent bloodshed. The problem? Using race to control violence doesn't reduce it. It cements it. And over time, racial boundaries hardened into permanent fault lines. Medical neglect and preventable deaths. If violence didn't kill inmates at San Quentin, neglect often did. Medical requests went unanswered. Appointments were delayed for weeks. Specialists were rarely available. Inmates with chronic illnesses deteriorated visibly. Diabetes, heart disease, respiratory conditions. Emergencies were treated with suspicion. Chest pain was dismissed. Seizures were questioned. Mental health crises were disciplined. Investigations later found deaths that could have been prevented with basic care. Simple antibiotics, routine monitoring, timely intervention. Instead, families received calls too late. Explanations were vague. Records incomplete. One judge later described the situation as a systemic failure to meet the minimum standard of care. That finding would change everything. By now, San Quentin wasn't just under scrutiny. It was under federal threat. Because when prisons fail at this scale, the courts don't just criticize. They intervene. The courts step in. For decades, San Quentin operated with minimal interference. Then, the courts lost patience. Judges reviewing the evidence didn't just see isolated failures. They saw patterns. Overcrowding so severe it eliminated basic safety. Medical systems that routinely missed life-threatening conditions. Mental health care so inadequate it violated constitutional standards. In ruling after ruling, the language sharpened. Words like mismanagement gave way to systemic failure. One federal judge wrote that California's prison system had created conditions where inmates face a substantial risk of serious harm every day. That sentence changed everything. Because once a court acknowledges ongoing harm, it has authority to act. San Quentin was no longer just a state problem. It was a federal concern. Federal oversight of California prisons. Federal oversight didn't arrive with sirens. It arrived with paperwork. Monitors were appointed. Reports were demanded. Timelines were imposed. California was ordered to reduce overcrowding, improve medical staffing, rebuild mental health infrastructure. San Quentin became a case study, a symbol of what happens when prisons grow faster than accountability. Administrators pushed back. They argued reforms would take time, that budgets were limited, that safety concerns made change difficult. Courts responded bluntly. Time had already run out. For the first time, San Quentin was being judged not by tradition, but by constitutional standards. And those standards were unforgiving. San Quentin during COVID. Then came COVID-19. And every failure inside San Quentin collided at once. The prison was overcrowded. Ventilation was poor. Medical staffing was already stretched thin. When the virus entered the facility, it spread fast. Inmates were housed too close together to isolate. Staff moved between units, unknowingly carrying infection. Protective equipment arrived late. Hundreds of inmates tested positive. Some died. Investigations later revealed that transfers from other prisons, already experiencing outbreaks, were brought into San Quentin without proper testing. Families demanded answers. Courts demanded explanations. And the public saw something undeniable. A prison already ruled unconstitutional was now deadly. COVID didn't create San Quentin's problems. It exposed them. By now, San Quentin wasn't just failing inmates. It was failing public trust. And with the spotlight fully on, the state had no choice but to respond. But whether that response meant real change was another question entirely. Constitutional violations exposed. When courts finally laid out the findings in plain language, there was no room left to hide. Judges concluded that conditions inside San Quentin violated the Constitution in multiple ways. Not hypothetically, not potentially, actively. The Eighth Amendment, protection against cruel and unusual punishment, had been breached through extreme overcrowding, prolonged isolation, inadequate medical care, systemic neglect of mental illness. What made these findings so powerful wasn't the violence alone. It was foreseeability. The state knew these conditions caused harm. The state had been warned repeatedly, and the state failed to act. That combination, knowledge plus inaction, transformed neglect into liability. One ruling stated plainly, these conditions are incompatible with the dignity of man. That sentence echoed far beyond San Quentin, because it suggested something radical. That institutional control, when pushed far enough, becomes unconstitutional by nature. The guards who spoke out. For years, silence protected San Quentin. Then it cracked. Some guards, longtime employees, began speaking out, not to defend inmates, but to describe what the system had turned them into. They described working double shifts in crumbling units, responding to medical emergencies without training, being ordered to enforce policies they knew were harmful. One former officer admitted, "We weren't trained to help people. We were trained to contain problems." Others described retaliation for raising concerns. Lost over time. Worse assignments. Sudden disciplinary write-ups. Speaking out meant becoming a liability. And liability had no place in a prison built on control. These testimonies mattered because they showed the damage wasn't limited to inmates. The institution was burning through everyone inside it. Death row reform attempts. Under mounting pressure, California finally moved. Death row began to change. Executions were halted. Cages were dismantled. Some inmates were transferred to other facilities. Plans were announced to renovate San Quentin entirely, to replace punishment architecture with rehabilitation-focused design. But reform was slow and partial. Some inmates benefited immediately. Others waited years. Critics argued the changes addressed symptoms, not causes. That removing cages didn't undo decades of trauma. That structural brutality couldn't be fixed with renovations alone. One advocate put it bluntly: you can change the building, but if you don't change the philosophy, you just build a newer version of the same prison. San Quentin stood at a crossroads, not between old and new, but between control and humanity. San Quentin had been exposed. The courts had spoken. The public was watching. But one question still hung in the air. Why, after everything, was this prison still standing? Why San Quentin was never closed? By every rational metric, San Quentin should have closed decades ago. It's overcrowded. It's outdated. It's surrounded by some of the most expensive real estate in the country. And yet, it remains open. The reason isn't mystery. It's institutional gravity. San Quentin holds symbolic power. It's embedded in California's prison identity. It centralizes high-security inmates near courts and hospitals. Closing it would force the state to admit something profound: that decades of policy failed. And that failure would ripple outward into budgets, elections, and public trust. So instead of closure, the state chose endurance. Renovate instead of replace. Rebrand instead of rebuild. Reform just enough to survive legal pressure. San Quentin didn't persist because it worked. It persisted because dismantling it would require accountability. Inmates who survived decades inside. Some men entered San Quentin in their 20s. They left in their 60s, if they left at all. Decades inside an institution built on control changes people. Men learn to speak softly, to avoid eye contact, to compress their emotions into something manageable. Some adapted. Others broke quietly. Survivors describe time as something that stopped behaving normally. Years passed without milestones. Seasons blurred together. Life outside became abstract. One long-term inmate said, "You don't age here like people outside. You erode." These men weren't statistics. They were living evidence of what prolonged institutional control does to a human being. And when they finally stepped outside, many found the world louder, faster, harsher than anything inside. Freedom wasn't relief. It was shock. California's prison contradiction. California prides itself on reform, on progress, on second chances. And yet, it maintained one of the most brutal prison environments in the country for decades. This is the contradiction at the heart of the system. A state that champions human rights while defending institutions that violated them. San Quentin wasn't an outlier. It was a warning that reform language means nothing if control remains the priority, that constitutional rights don't disappear suddenly. They erode. One policy, one exception, one emergency at a time. And San Quentin showed how easy that erosion becomes when the people affected are invisible. By now, the pattern was clear. Institutional control had won for decades. But the question remained: when control collides with human rights, who decides where the line is drawn? Institutional control versus human rights. At its core, San Quentin wasn't built to rehabilitate. It was built to control. Control movement. Control noise. Control bodies. And for decades, that control was treated as success. But constitutional rights don't disappear at the prison gate. They are tested there. San Quentin forced courts to confront a hard truth. Order can exist without justice. Efficiency can coexist with cruelty. And institutions can function while violating the law. Human rights advocates argued that brutality didn't come from chaos. It came from routine, from policies that normalized isolation, from medical systems that triaged suffering, from force used to maintain predictability. The state countered with familiar language: safety, security, operational necessity. But over time, those words lost their power. Because when control becomes the goal, human dignity becomes optional. San Quentin proved that constitutional violations don't always come from bad actors. They come from good intentions hardened into systems. The future of San Quentin. Today, San Quentin stands at a crossroads. Executions are halted. Death row is dismantled. Reform plans promise transformation. Architects talk about open spaces. Lawmakers talk about rehabilitation. Administrators talk about change. But history casts a long shadow. Because reform isn't measured by announcements. It's measured by outcomes. Will isolation truly end, or just be renamed? Will medical care be proactive, or merely compliant? Will control finally give way to accountability? San Quentin's future matters because it answers a larger question. Can an institution built on punishment learn restraint? Or will control always reassert itself? The moment pressure returns? What San Quentin leaves behind? San Quentin is more than walls and cells. It's a record of choices made, warnings ignored, rights delayed until courts intervened. It shows us that brutality doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it arrives as policy. Sometimes it hides behind efficiency. Sometimes it survives because no one wants to dismantle it. The real legacy of San Quentin isn't what happened inside. It's what it asks of us now. Whether we believe constitutional rights are universal or conditional. Whether control is enough, or whether humanity must come first. Because prisons don't just reflect who we punish. They reveal who we are. If this story made you uncomfortable, it should have. Because San Quentin wasn't a failure of law. It was a failure of restraint. What you just saw is more than a story. It's a reality lived by thousands behind bars. If you believe in uncovering the truth, the kind hidden behind concrete walls and silence, then join us. Subscribe to Behind Bars TV and never miss a chapter in the world's most dangerous stories. Until next time, stay aware, stay informed, and stay locked in. Until next time, keep your mind open and your curiosity sharp. Remember, freedom and confinement are sometimes only a wall apart.